there is law in the land, and there are entities in your landscapes, and there are entities in each kind of bioregion. New bioregions, like, they kind of set their own borders, and for most of human history, we've lived within those borders, and people have been of those places and of those entities and connected to them profoundly. And quite a few of those entities have this kind of duality, particularly when they're kind of dwelling in areas where there's change, where there's edge, from high ground to low ground, or particularly from freshwater to saltwater. So where your saltwater land ends along the coast and starts to transition into freshwater, then that's where you find, entities that will be like, half fish, half human, that's where those spirits are in the land like that. So, the land itself is the map, and the land carries the law and contains the law. And you come to know those entities in the law and those substances and forces that they exude, in that place. And these shape you. They shape us all, like, really quite profoundly. In those places, they shape the language we speak. They shape the cultures that develop, and particularly the cultural technologies that we have, such as theater and things like this. These are not just performances, these are technologies, and they're almost spiritual technologies. Now, at some stage, there's a particular, something about this two-ness that's important to creation. And it's that kind of, this action, it's a balance, a tension and balance between opposites that keeps creation in motion. It's one thing and it's the other, but it's a third thing as well. And there's something in that interaction of, for example, fresh and salt, that there's a tremendous energy and power that comes out of those things. And it happens in cycles, seasonally. So those kind of beings that are two things, they're constantly coming apart and going back together and keeping creation in motion. But something happened in the Northern Hemisphere, like, I think not that long ago at all, like maybe 10,000 years, maybe a bit less. But something happened, and it might have had something to do with rising sea levels, I'm not sure. But something happened where there were a few of those beings that were two or three things, where they started to have a different kind of duality, a different kind of two-ness that wasn't unifying, and that it wasn't creative anymore, and it wasn't satisfied. So you ended up with beings like this Dionysius. You ended up with these entities that they didn't become dual. They stopped being dual beings, and they became binary entities. And this binarization, this was a thing that sort of entered the spirit of the world in the Northern Hemisphere, which is really interesting, because you got those two hemispheres spinning in different directions. So I guess there's people in this meeting now that if you nip off to the bathroom, your the water in your sink is going to go in different directions down the plug hole. That's because of that Coriolis effect of those two halves, those two hemispheres. So that's really, in a way, the nature of the spirit of the planet that we're on. It has that duality. But there were these entities that instead they became binary, and they spread like a virus. And, I believe there were a lot of technologies that sort of came out, with their interactions with the people there. And I think theater is a really good example of one of those technologies that arose from that. you know, they demanded that people have different kinds of ceremonial and ritual interactions with them that produced a different way of being in the landscape. And that changed things. So, for example, and it was right there in Greece where they invented this first big separation, this first big binary, and it was the one that killed us all, that killed everything on Earth. I'm thinking from a point in the future now. And that was the separation of nature and society. Because for the million years before that, nature and society were not separate things. You know, our society was embedded in the landscape. It was of the landscape, and it was following the patterning of creation and spirit in the landscape. So our law was built on that natural law of what was there in the land. And so you had these collectives, autonomous collectives in each bioregion. And then all the bioregions together, you know, in a larger region, they kind of form a collective of autonomous collectives, if you like. And, you know, and there were laws and rituals and everything traded along those, and that governed the way people were supposed to be together. So while we had a lot of violence and warfare, historically, the damage done from these things has been quite limited traditionally, because warfare and conflict has always been highly ritualized, very ritualized, and with certain protocols that ensured that not too much damage was done, you know, but that the violence would not be concentrated there wouldn't be monopolies of violence where only certain castes or certain groups of people would get to monopolize that violence. So that was evenly distributed throughout the system. But then what happened with this binary, rather than the duality, you know, of humans as a custodial species, you know, being of the land, but being able to see it and to act upon it in ways that would keep creation in motion, instead of that duality, we ended up with this binarization. And so when we separated nature and society, we started forming these enclosures. And these sort of, it's like a curse, these enclosures. We even took the Creation Serpent, so human beings, us as human beings, and I include us all, but although it began in the northern hemisphere there, they took that Creation Serpent and they put it in a circle and made it eat its tail, forming a great enclosure of creation. So it's this kind of magical thinking whereby the desire was to create this artificial infinity, this idea of, instead of increase ceremonies in the landscape, instead we would have this idea of infinite growth. And so we had these monopolies on violence that were kind of accrued in little groups around certain privileged elites, you know, in these communities, or individuals or families that would end up having a monopoly on violence and sort of terrorize everybody else with that, and force everybody into conforming to these growth-based models. And so that we ended up with a bit of a tragedy of the commons starting up there in the northern hemisphere, with this multipolar trap of, you really just need one bad actor to start misusing the commons for their own, you know, betterment, and then everybody has to do it, otherwise they'll be outcompeted by that person. And so you end up with this endless cycle of destruction that begins. And that's essentially what a civilization is. You know, a civilization is acting on that curse. And there were a lot of ritual magics that came out of that part of the world in that time. And you can see it in Crete and different places. But so you see these things like the labyrinth, I don't know if you're familiar with that labyrinth pattern, but I suspect that labyrinth pattern lies beneath every city, and that every city is built on that pattern. And I think, just from my reading of the ancient Greeks, that there's a way that you can undo that curse, or that magic of that labyrinth, to cause a city to fall. And I don't want to give anyone ideas, and I'm not advocating this to anybody, but what you got to do is you have to kill a prince of that city and drag him around that city sort of 3 times at least. You got to drag him around the outskirts of the city, and that undoes the magic of that pattern that keeps that city there, and then the city will fall. And I think you might recognize that as something that Achilles did to Hector back in the day. You know, he killed him and then dragged him in his chariot around the thing. I think it was anti-clockwise. I can't remember which direction he went. But anyway, you could check that up if you wanted to try it out anywhere. But not that I'm advocating that at all. But a city is basically operating on a curse, on this kind of illusion magic of infinite growth. This idea that you can keep growing into infinity, and they only last about 1,000 years tops usually. But this global civilization, this Anglosphere, it kind of found a different sort of magical loophole to extend it by about another century after it should have fallen. You know, because you look at some of the earliest civilizations in what they call the Fertile Crescent. You go Middle East and you look where the first civilizations were, and they're in the desert, and you think, man, why would anyone build a city in the desert? Well, let me tell you, it wasn't a desert when they built it. You know, civilizations make deserts, and that's what happens. I'm in the middle of this terrible one now. We've got like we got about 1/3 of Australia's population in this poxy city where I'm living right now in Melbourne. And yeah, you try drive around and it's right on the edge of turning into desert. It won't be long. You know, this is a terrible place. But max, they can last as long as they keep outsourcing their entropy to other places and going and destroying other bioregions. They can last about 1,000 years. And traditionally, civilizations are powered by slaves from those places that they take. So civilizations usually run on slave power. And but basically everything ran out in this civilization of the Anglosphere. It ran out and was starting to collapse. But then they gave it a little bit of more longevity when they discovered ghost slaves. And those ghost slaves were the creatures long dead for millions of years, you know, under the earth, under great pressures, and they turned into something else. You know, that's your fossil fuels. So they were able to extract the spirit from those and power the civilization for a little bit longer. But those entities were doing their work of keeping the things out of the air that needed to be kept out of the air and storing them down good and deep in order to create the homeostasis, you know, of the system that we enjoy today. So yeah, these binary entities really did spread this message everywhere, and they separated everything. They didn't stop with just nature and society. They also had to separate men and women. They separated the entire society into different castes, with the slaves at the bottom, and just above them were women, you know. So they even made gender into a caste. And so they created these hierarchies. Now, traditionally in human cultures around the world, hierarchies have only ever been temporary things, you know, in order to do one project. Or if you're in a certain place and that family speaks for the entities and story and spirit of that place, then you'll listen to that family and follow their authority. you know, as you're moving around the landscape in your bioregion, you know, all different families speak for different parts of that bioregion. Different individuals in that family speak for different parts of those parts, you know, so everybody holds authority, power, and that's distributed throughout the community. You do have a kind of a gerontocracy that emerges, whereby the people with the most knowledge have the most authority, but authority is very different from power, you know. And that's funny, like those are things that need to be separate, power and authority. So I guess in the modern system, the current industrial system, the idea and the promise was that the state would hold authority and the corporations would hold power. And I guess we know what happens when you merge those two things together that probably shouldn't be, you know, power and authority, you know, together in one entity that's ruling your landscape, tends to have some pretty bad consequences. I believe they call that fascism, which is something else that we're on the edge of right now. Yeah, many places in the world. Anyway, so this system of enclosures sort of ended up spreading everywhere. And that's just been in the last few centuries, particularly starting in the United States, where they invented this magic trick called the mortgage. And they used that to trick Indians out of their reservation land. So, you know, the tiny scraps of land that Native Americans were left with, they invented a sort of a financial magic trick to trick them out of that, you know, and that was that, well, land can be capital now, and that's capital that can be borrowed against, and therefore can be not just enclosed, but it can be foreclosed. And everything's about those closings, see? And so they did that. They were like, here, have some shiny beads and just make your mark on this piece of paper. And then they come back in 12 months and say, well, you owe us money with interest. Oh, we foreclose, you lose your land. And land had never been capital in that way before. You know, and under British mercantile law, even land was not treated as capital in that way. So anyway, that worked so well that they started exporting it all over the world. And pretty soon it wasn't just used on the natives, it was used for everybody, that big magic trick. And so they developed this surveying technology, you know, to carve up every inch of the entire planet, every inch of the surface of the planet into these enclosures to be capital. And so that's the financial system that we have today. That financial system, which is this, it's another magic trick where you can just make derivatives on derivatives on derivatives into infinity in order to extract maximum value forever and to funnel it into these little static heaps of death, you know, that are usually accrued by the same people who make who have the monopolies on violence also gather those monopolies on capital, you know. So we get this sort of continuing on forever, and every time the civilization is in its death throes, it reaches out more and tries another magic trick, and it is always the same magic trick replicated over and over of that binarization of things. And so we get a you know, a French he was an alchemist, a French guy about 500 years ago or so. He I can't remember his name, but he borrowed a divination ritual from Africa that involved these ones and zeros you know, in order to tell the future. So he used that magic and he brought that into the Northern Hemisphere. And anyway, eventually that was incorporated into the body of law that was alchemy, you know, which was all about using those binarizations to try and magic into existence things that were not. It was trying to make these creations, you know, to turn one substance magically into another substance, etc. Anyway, they kind of, yeah, that eventually that got that became used to make the computers that we're talking through right now. That binary code. That binary code is that same. It's a kind of, it's a magic trick, you know, and it's sorcery. I feel like, you know, and because it's doing that same thing again. So when you use this computer, everything is a choice. It took me ages to get into this meeting today because there were all these buttons that I had to click, that they were yes, no answers. Will you allow it or will you deny it? You know, and, you know, these entities, they're like those forced choices. They don't like you to have a constellation of options in front of you. They like you to choose, will you get into that cattle truck or will you get shot in the head? You know, and we need to recognize that as organisms, our patterning is different from that. And that there's always a third option and a fourth option and a fifth option, and that we can take those choices. I chose to come into this meeting today, though, so I kept clicking yes. We're all being trained into this. Every time we click yes, do you agree to these conditions that you haven't read, or are you excluded? It's like, oh, well, I want to be included. I agree. I haven't read it, but I agree. And every time that contract, so that contract was another trick that was invented to try and control the future. You know, part of this bigger trick of making time run in a straight line. We know that from the second law of thermodynamics, that in a closed system, there's that closed again, that magic. You know, in a closed system, entropy increases over time. Like I mentioned before, civilizations try to outsource their entropy because that's a loophole they can't get past when they make their time run in a straight line. Yeah, so that they control the past by telling us a really crappy story about what we were before the civilization. Then they control the present with laws and rules that they write down. This is all done with writing, by the way. It came out about the same time from those same crappy entities. And then they control the future with contracts. So every time you come in here, you do a Faustian pact. Every time you come into a goddamn Zoom meeting and have to click yes several times to get in there. It's one of these Faustian pacts here. So we're all operating under the same illusion magic. And like I said before, we are all there. You know, like I said before, I've been to ceremonies that are secret ceremonies that don't have audiences. Ceremonies that are usually done in a group, you know, or a circle, or a line that is moving. And now I go to those ceremonies, and a lot of them, they're done in a rectangle. Stage left, stage right, center stage, all this, you know, and all facing in the same direction, all facing this fourth wall. You know, there's these little magic tricks, and they're very enticing. And I'm wondering where that will end up. You know, I'm wondering if these binary entities are ever going to be able to come back together and reunite. I'm wondering if that's our job now, if we've got to look at the split that we have right down the middle of us. You know, this left brain, right brain, all these all these dualities that we're being forced to inhabit, that aren't dualities, they're binarisms. You know, you're either this or you're that. You know, you're making these consumer choices all the time, and they split your spirit. They split it in halves in the wrong way. In our relationships, you know, the way we treat each other in our relationships, we're not together. We're split. We're these two special individuals competing with each other. We're all supposed to compete. You know, we're all supposed to dominate. We all hope to come out on top. We're all trying for our narrative to become the one that beats the other narratives and becomes the ideology. And it's going to attract people to you, And then you're going to be out there in cyberspace with all these people who are parroting your words, and that you're going to be able to set the tone for that and say what the words are going to be. And then you'll be able to just get everybody purity testing and policing each other left and right and witch hunting all over the shop, and, exclude them. Everything's about inclusion and exclusion. So this system of finance, this economy, global economy that we're operating under, has the same trick. Nothing can have a price unless it has excludability and limitability. So if you discover an infinite resource, if you, like diamonds, for example, there's more diamonds in vaults than there are Tic Tacs in this world. You have to find a way to limit that resource. And if you can limit it so that most people are missing out, or the lower caste people are missing out, then it's something that can be priced. And you can up the price through limitability. And by extension, by excludability. Things only have value if you can exclude most people or a lot of people from it. So that's what we do. We split ourselves, we divide ourselves, we make these endless stacks upon the landscape, dividing things that should never have been divided. And so now we have cyberspace, this magical realm that the binaristic godlings or demons, from the Northern Hemisphere have, moved us into all these next level spiritual technologies. And where did they find the cyberspace? The people who designed it. You don't have to look far into it. The people are still alive. You can talk to them. But they were all, they started out with peyote and things like this. And, they were going on trips, and then they managed to synthesize LSD. And so they went, to another place, and they were skating around on the edge of the spirit world, and they didn't know what it is. They didn't have a map for that landscape. So they just floated in that space, and all they saw was endless possibilities. Finally, a frontier with infinite space to grow and to enclose. And they sought to go in there and enclose those spaces. And so they dreamt up this cyberspace. And then they used the binaries of ones and zeros to create it, even though that's a very inefficient way of harnessing the power of electrons to do your computing for you. There are heaps better ways. Why would you have a bit when you could have a qubit? Anyway, but they need that for the magic to work. It's got to be binarized. It's got to be a forced choice at every spot. You've got to be facing that one direction, that fourth wall, and making it powerful. So we create this cyberspace, and we go into it, and we carry our little dualistic, binaristic conflicts into that space, and then we create enclosures there. And so we start to colonize the world of spirit in this space where our image can be replicated infinitely. And my old people tell me that when you make an image of something, it's something that has spirit. It's an entity that exists. But the more of those images you make, you kill its spirit. The more you break its spirits down. It's like Voldemort in Harry Potter with the Horcruxes. He split his soul up. It's like that. So your image, is part of your spirit. And that is in this cyberspace being infinitely replicated, infinitely divided, and it's pretty much dividing your soul. And so there we all are. And they're kind of working on, as soon as they can figure out what consciousness is, then they're ready. They've got the tech to upload that consciousness for us into that place. So we can finally do the ultimate separation of separating from our bodies. We've already separated our bodies from the land. Now we need to separate our spirit from our bodies and put it into a place that can be controlled, can be enclosed, and howl around forever in an eternity of torment together, just trying to break ourselves down into smaller and smaller pieces until it's all gone. But maybe some people will be on a rocket to Mars, who knows? Yeah, so that's, sorry, someone said Dionysius, so I went that way. What do you think, Jonathan? Have I conflated too much out of this?
Well, I mean,
all the rest.
I love what you've said. I love it.
It's just a theory.
And I'm getting a bad echo on my machine. I don't quite know why. So that there is a binary going on in my head, because I can hear everything that I say in echo. Oh, now
yeah, we can too, but that's really appropriate.
Okay.
So speak with those two tongues.
I shall try to,
Uncle.
or I shall try not to. But anyway, the thing is that you're speaking. If you're speaking to me, you're speaking to somebody from the Northern Hemisphere, from somebody who is imbued and has been soaked and permeated by this culture over millennium. Like a kind of the center of me is fossilized in within and drenched in this liquor that you're talking about. And I'm wondering whether, I mean, and I think that at the same time, the people around where we're living in the Northern Hemisphere, also there are people trying to tell the story. And I think that one of the things I'm thinking is it possible to break this binarism through knowledge, through more knowledge, or through less knowledge, or through knowledge itself? What do we do? How do we break it? How do we break the magic that you've described? And that's, I think, what concerns me, and maybe it concerns me too much. But one of the ways in which that knowledge is loosened is just by looking at history and trying to understand history. Because, as you said, it's a great mystery. Why? Why did it happen in the Northern Hemisphere? What happened? Was it empire? What happened in the Greek civilization? How did the Romans take over from the Greek civilization? How did the Romans start to colonize? How did the Romans start to extract and enslave and to put enclosures around their colonies and put a border around their empire? That, I think, was the first empire that did that. And how was it that emerging out of that, as that empire was taken over by this extraordinary dualistic religion, which had at its center a god person, a man god, somebody that had this dual personality, or a binary personality that you could say, and how was that binariness installed into the Roman Empire by the takeover from the inside of that religion, of the empire, adopted by that empire? And how did that influence the movement that happened at the end of the Roman Empire of people moving into the territory of the Roman Empire and starting to divide up the empire as a physical power from the empire as a spiritual power? And how was it that doubleness of political power was installed into the nation states of the Northern Hemisphere? This was our great damnation and curse and invention, because the nation state, you talk about the monopolization of violence. Well, the monopolization of violence happens through the sanctification and sacralization of the political power of the empire. And those processes, those nation states, they took a long time to form, but you can see in history the actual formation of those nation states leading up to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, if you like. And so I think that what I'm concerned with is trying to track that history, to understand that history of hierarchization, about which I've learned such a lot from anthropology and from radical anthropology, but trying to build on that and take it forward and to try to understand how that's been moved forward into our own date. And I don't have any sense of any high chance of success, because there's no success in this business. There's just trying to kind of work it out and share it.
Well, to answer a few of those things, your knowledge, yeah, that's a way through. But knowledge, the way we do it now is by extraction and enclosure again. And those enclosures are called universities. And that's another snake that's eating itself. You know, we need to price knowledge, and we need to have knowledge as capital. And so we accrue that into these horribly entropic heaps. And basically, we know through complexity science that anything like that needs to be distributed throughout the system quite evenly in order for that system to be self-organizing and to be able to continue indefinitely. You know, a long-lived system has to have everything evenly distributed throughout it. All forces, all things, from violence to knowledge to everything else. You know, and who knows how this binary curse. I mean, you know, spirit moves to correct things in these systems, and you know, we have a lot of non-binary people now stepping up and putting memes, sigils, and all kinds of things out there. And maybe they're the ones who are starting to turn things around for us, and they're probably worth listening to a little bit. You know, so there's those. Maybe it's a lot of non-binarism that will, you know, change things. And look, those people have always been sacred in our communities because they've held something important. They've held that dualism, you know, the ability to be, you know, one thing and the other, which therefore makes a third thing. And that's one of the patterns of creation. You know, one thing that becomes two. You know, like that impact from Old Man Juma, and that's his sort of algorithm for creation that he sees on the turtle shell in that I talk about him in that book Sand Talk. You know, there's that point of impact at the Big Bang, and it cracks one thing out. So you have one, and then you have two, and then that becomes three, which becomes five. And those five circles together in the spaces that creates, which is 8 spaces, then that cracks out into that way. And then that makes 13. And then onwards and onwards in this Fibonacci sequence, you know, which is more than 500 years old, I can assure you, because we've had that in our law here for a long time, you know. But we're all coming from that same story, and we're seeing a lot of the same stars. You know, we're seeing a lot of the same constellations. And I guess you could see that it's funny I picked up these things because you've got those binaries in this, and you won't be able to see it properly, but I've got on one side that is quite female and one is quite male, and you've got this Orion constellation and this Pleiades constellation, and this sort of two sides, you know, male and female spirit. You know, are constantly chasing each other across the sky. And all around the world, that Pleiades, that's just this shapeless little cluster of not even 7 stars. Everybody, like a lot of different cultures call it, even the Greeks called it the 7 sisters. You know, they called that in Africa, Indonesia, everywhere. We all come out from one place. We're one people. You know, everybody looks at that just sort of vague rhombus of Orion and they go, that's a hunter or a warrior. You know, how are we all talking the same story for Orion? We're talking the same story because we're looking at the same entity, and we're all coming from one place. You know, and then that comes out into a multiplicity of different stories and different entities in all our bioregions. and they have those lines of creation and power running through them, mapped into the landscape. And that's on this boomerang, which you can't really see it, but there's a lot of song lines that are carved into that I was walking while I made this. I made it over about a year of walking a lot of different song lines, and found that they often all intersected and they matched up and went right across the continent, these ones. So a song line that you thought ended somewhere, it actually connected up with another one and kept going. And it's this sort of web of law in the landscape. And the law is there. And that tells you your limits. It tells you when you need to stop. So that is the thing that's prevented the tragedy of the commons forever, that common law. And we've had a continental common law in Australia for a long time. And we've traded a lot of the technologies that come from that internationally for thousands of years. You know, we've had trade relations going up into Asia and into New Guinea that are well documented, you know, where we've traded a lot of technologies and ideas, you know, and law. And we know those song lines go under the sea and they go up into Asia there, you know. So we've even had, it's proposed that we've had interactions with Polynesians. We've got a lot of story. So we've got story here for our old people going to Hawaii, and they've got story there in their oral history of us going there and teaching them ways of ritualized warfare that made sure that conflict would never do too much damage. You know, so these are technologies that we've, you know, we didn't invent them, but we've been reminding people of them for a long time. This, I just, because I'm talking about that law, then I'll show you this law stick here. You know, so there's a lot of stuff in there. This is just a place that I was working with when I was thinking about that idea of what holistic actually means, and trying to map that out, you know, through all these different seasonal plants and medicines. So that's the one. It's got the chapter for that in the book of Lemonade for Headaches was the name of that chapter. So, you know, you see that duality in these things. This is, a lot of people think of boomerang in a certain way. And boomerang is something you'll find all around the world. The oldest one was actually found in Poland, and it was carved from a mammoth tusk. Hey, we got a Polak down there who's pretty pleased about that. You know, there were boomerangs in Tutankhamun's tomb, you know, but there was nowhere in the world with more advanced and diverse forms of boomerangs than Australia. So that toy one that you see internationally, the one that comes back that everyone's fascinated with, that was just a toy for children, but we got all kinds of different ones. You know, the one I showed you before, this one is a killer boomerang that doesn't come back. It just goes straight and breaks legs and such. This one is a fishing boomerang. I love fishing boomerangs because they can fit nicely in your man bag. You know, and yeah, the amount of times I've taken this on airplanes, I'll tell you what, any terrorists want to come on an airplane, I'm going to fix them up with this one. But yeah, so you have here, this one, when you spin it, there's that, you know, there is a duality that is one thing. So there's a sign on here from Old Man Juma's sand talk symbols, you know, that's for place and space. Looks at those directions that are constantly moving. Yeah, so you've got first man and first woman story there. In that one, and the directions they traveled in that made those directions and made that map and that place. But in our languages, there's no separate words for time and space. So, and you can see that on the next one, that time. So that's the model of time, as you can see, that one. And it kind of, if you look at that for long enough, you'll see that it's actually a 3D image, and it comes up at you in this sort of toroidal shape, where the outside is constantly moving back into the inside in this kind of apple shape. And of course, that's what the universe does, and that's how energy moves. And that's time, but it's also place, just as this is. And those two dualisms, they come together.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's about time and seasonality.
Chris, can you maybe tell a little bit about yourself? Chris is a radical anthropologist, professor from UCL, and he works also now in the Indigenous Australian people.
Well, I mean, that is a big exaggeration. My daughter went to Australia, but I've never been near that corner of the world, or huge landscape in the world, of course. But no, I had a very simple question, which is, could you say something about other forms of cyclicity than seasonality, and simply the moon, please? Because that's of huge interest to me, the way in which, certainly in this part of the world, the Anglosphere, the moon is regarded as hugely dangerous to be put down, all kinds of words about moonshine and lunacy and stuff. And I gather, Tyson, that the moon was magical and had a kind of two-ness, which wasn't the binary. It was a two-ness of the kind that you were saying. I mean, I was so moved by a discussion of the kind of two-ness which you illustrate with your hands, which moves and generates and produces life, and the other kind of two-ness, which is the binary, the fourth choice, which is death. So where does the moon come within that framework?
Well, in the northern hemisphere, the moon is female, and the sun is male.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
You ended up. There's another one of those binarisms where the male, the sun, gained ascendancy over the female, the moon.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
They
really tried with time. They had to struggle with time to try and make it fit.
Yeah.
It wasn't a cycle, but that went in a line. So they invented these 4 seasons when there aren't 4 seasons anywhere on the planet. That's an economic schedule.
Exactly.
When you harvest shit.
Yep.
Yeah.
And and the moon's got her own ideas about that. You talk to any biodynamic agrarian and they'll tell you a different way, but she's got a different idea there in that northern hemisphere. And he has a different idea down here, because in the southern hemisphere the moon is male.
Yes.
The sun is female.
Yes.
See, down here, it's a Promethea, not a Prometheus. It's a that fire is a woman's thing. Here. But the fire in the northern hemisphere is a man's thing. And in the northern hemisphere, there ended up being an ascendancy. With trying to make these calendars work, they had to kind of suppress the moon, because she's out of step with that sun, and you can't make your months work in that way.
You're one of us.
As women know, the cycles can be irregular, and they do form a pattern over deeper time. But in the short term, she does what she bloody wants to do. Yeah. So it's funny, because, the moon is one of those things that makes a communication between that sky camp and the earth, and between those two different realms of spirit and the tangible world. It has a lot of pull with that. There are a lot of forces. But then there is also, I told you about how your image is spirit. So you've got that moon shine you mentioned. That's on the water at night. You're on the coast, and that moon's shining on the water. Now, from your point of view, where you're standing on the beach, you only see that in one place. But actually, it's everywhere.
Of course.
Someone standing right beside you is seeing moon shine in a different place. And as you walk along the beach, it'll seem like that thing's following you. You know, you keep seeing it in that subjective viewpoint of where you're standing at that time. And when the truth of it is more of an aggregate of all the people, if they lined up along that beach, all of their points of view would represent the truth.
Yeah.
Same with the rainbow, you know, you tell your kid, you're driving along and your kid's going, hey, we're going to drive under that rainbow. And you say, no, we're not. That rainbow's not where you're seeing it. That rainbow's everywhere. That's a rainbow snake everywhere.
Can you say a little more about the Creation Serpent?
Yeah.
More about, and the moon and the seasons and women.
He reveals through water, but we all see him a different way. And every bioregion's got its own story for that everywhere on the planet. Now, the moon, it's the same thing. The moon man, he's a tricky man.
Yeah.
And he tricks people with that illusion, with that image. You know, when they get too caught up with their subjective view of that image of the moon on the water, he can get them. He can take them up. You know, and that happened in for Two Sisters story. I know that's from up north. But that story, there was those two sisters, they were hunting bonefish at night, because you hunt them at night in a canoe. With, they get attracted to that fire. So, of course, that's women doing that because they own that fire. So they got those fire torches, and it brings the bonefish up, and then they spear them and put them in the canoe. And they had heaps, but then they saw one more really big one out there. But it wasn't. It was a trick from the moon. It was just the moon image on the water. But they thought it was a really big bonefish, so they went after that. And so they kept paddling out. But what happens to that? Can you ever reach that image? You can't. You know, the closer you get to it, the further it gets away. And so he tricked them that way. And then that action happened again. You know, that one, because there's overlaps, communications between those two worlds, and you get these little turnarounds that happen. And so they went like that how they did that trick in the Pirates of the Caribbean, where they tipped the boat over and came up in the other place. It's kind of like that, you know. So those ladies were tipped over with the trick of that image, and they were taken up. So when you look at the moon anywhere in the world, you can see there's two shadow shapes in the moon. That's those two sisters there.
Oh.
Yeah, they got taken up, and they're still there today. Those ones, yeah. But yeah, so that's the interesting thing. But so time, place, they're all like that, you know. And time is time would work better. A more accurate model of time, I think, would be based on the first law of thermodynamics rather than the second law, so that nothing's created and destroyed. Law is probably better if we're talking about these infinite systems exchanging matter and transforming energy and matter and passing it across infinitely. So it's sort of recycling through and in between and across systems. That would more accurately map a truly human model of time. This arrow of time is based on the enclosure of the second law of thermodynamics. That is some bullshit right there. That's an illusion, and it's a magic trick.
Just one more question about the Creation Serpent. I've never heard it put like this, but I just suddenly see when you have the serpent eating its own tail, that is the great killing. That is the great enclosure, and that is the labyrinth on which these cities are built. Somehow you've just put everything together in a few extra. Well, I don't know. You've just taught me so much in about 10 or 20 minutes. But
you have to talk to everybody, even the most marginal people. So you guys are way out of my pay grade. You're
Well, no. The other way around. No. You're I mean,
it's like Socrates talking to the stable boy.
Oh. No, we don't do that sort of stuff. We do reverse anthropology. You are our teacher, and so many of you. And I know you don't want your story to be the winning story, but I mean that's not what it's about. Your story is all of our stories, and we need to hear a lot more of it. And we need to get your voice heard, Tyson. I don't think ever heard it put so marvelously, powerfully as you've just put the whole story of life on Earth and history. And it's so I don't know. We need to get you heard, because I can't think of anything else.
I don't even have the story. It's just multitudes of.
Yeah, I know.
Stories.
I know, but where are they heard in this corner of the world? They're not heard. Those stories are not heard. You've been silenced for too long.
Well, I think that it's going to depend on whether or not we can unbinarize our discourse, find better ways of talking to each other.
Yeah.
Because nothing can come from one mind. It's got to be many together. It's like all the people on the beach seeing the moon in a different spot. It's only the aggregate that can actually tell you the truth of that, which is that the moon is shining on every part of the ocean at once.
Mm. Mm. Can I come in a little bit?
Please.
A bit of follow-up on the Chris and the moon. I'm another radical anthropologist. I haven't properly studied Australia, so it's really fascinating to hear you speaking. I study much more African hunter-gatherer religions and try to learn from there. But you've done a fascinating job of teaching us a perspective of human history here. But yeah, to talk about removing the binary from our discourse, of course I completely agree, but I also want to try and think about how do we practically break down this linear view of time? How do we practically change that and restore something? You just said something wonderful about women will do it when they bloody want to. And that's absolutely true, but there's also an aspect of ritual which may be inherited by theatre, which is that people are synchronizing and creating something together, that even if they do it when they bloody want to, they kind of bloody want to together. And somehow we need the moons, especially the moon's guidance, because as you've told us here about the moonshine on the sea, on the water, everybody is seeing that, even if from their own perspective. And all the women of the planet have this lunar aspect of cyclicity, even if it's a deep pattern. And then if you look at all religions of the world, the moon is at the bottom. The moon is there at the bottom. And what has really happened in the Northern Hemisphere is the cutting away from the moon by exactly what you say, the man-made months. The moon doesn't fit. The moon does what she, and she's become a she, but of course it's a he for hunter-gatherers of Africa or Australia. So yeah, what can we be? Can you offer advice about practical things we can do? I was speaking early in this series on Ecodemia about decolonizing time, that actually the control of time is the ultimate expression of white supremacy or Northern Hemisphere and kind of weird culture supremacy.
Decolonization is another binary curse.
Okay.
It contains the word colony in it. So it curses itself to replicate those structures. I don't know of a decolonized nation in all these ones that call themselves decolonized. They still have the same institutions and central bank and all the rest, you know, and they're just replicating the same thing to industrialize, to, you know, develop all these kinds of things.
Oh, yeah.
So that's not, I think the answer that you just asked, I think it's encounter curses. What's your favorite formation for a stage? Like there's a few different ones. What's the best one you think? For theater?
I mean, I'm not a theater buff. I'm.
Right. Have you ever experienced theater in the round?
I would imagine the round, because I would imagine participation and not theater as audience.
Yeah, theater in the round is what I think of as a counter curse. Theater in the round breaks that fourth wall, and it makes something else special. And I feel like those demonic entities from the Greek mountains can't see into that space. And all the audience is watching each other at the same time as it's watching the action inside. And the actors have to do something special. The Hamlet on the stage makes me fall asleep. Hamlet, when it's theater in the round, is probably the most exciting thing you can ever see. You know, and it's funny because the little dichotomous curses that are in there, like to be or not to be, like pick one. It's like even those little curses written into that play are broken when it's theater in the round. So we just create these, we have to be creating spiritual technologies like that are counter curses and that break that. You don't see theater in the round very much anymore. But I think it's an important one because it more adequately reflects what we've done forever as human beings. You know, we sit around for that ceremony and we see each other and we see that ceremony, that performance, we see it like that. So yeah, I think that a lot of the counter curses can be found in the actual true story of our Paleolithic pasts. And I think that any male anthropologist that's going to study anybody must be accompanied by a female anthropologist like yourself. So you saw, you know, back in the day, Napoleon Chagnon went out to the Yanomami Indians and he came back with the conclusion that they were the most violent people on earth. And out of his findings in there emerged the prototype of game theory, which informed this new economic system that we've been experiencing since the 70s. And you look at every graph from 1971 onwards, and you'll see a real split happen, a real binarization of a lot of things. Rich, poor, all kinds of things. You look at that website, WTF happened in 1971, and you look at graph after graph of every metric forking away from each other in that way. You know, that's that binarization happening again. But around the same time, there was a female anthropologist went and studied the same people. And she came back with the conclusion that they were the happiest people on earth. And she came up with a different technology from that around child rearing. And she wrote that book, The Continuum Concept, you know, which, you know, basically gave access to women all around the world to that child rearing technology that the Yanomami Indians had just perfected so well. When I read that book, I saw my own people's child rearing practices reflected in it. And it's those child rearing practices that give rise to contextual cognition, you know, which is very different, you know, from that fractured cognition that we're all forced to inhabit now in order to be able to hold down these things called jobs. You know, we have to employ what do they call it? Field independent cognition. It's independent of the field, independent of the context. Female anthropologists always see things that others don't. You know, those little discs that they kept finding in caves, those little bone or shell discs, you know, with these notches around the outside, like 28, 26, 32, 31. What the hell are these things? You know, and the male, the male scientists couldn't figure it out for so long until finally, you know, female ones arrived and they walk in the cave, pick it up, and they go, I know what that is. I got one of them in my handbag right now. These women were tracking their fertility so that they could control their reproduction. That's been happening forever. That power has always belonged to women. And women decide who comes in and who goes out and when. They always have. So I think, you know, for a truly radical anthropologist, you need to team up man, woman, and everything in between so that you don't miss anything. So maybe instead of decolonizing, we need to debinarize first.
Okay,
and then pretty much
I'll take the point of that.
Become irrelevant. And I think irrelevance is the most powerful counter curse you can do. We've got a lot of people in the world today binarizing and collectivizing around ideas like eat the rich. I mean, the rich love the attention, you know. They're always threatening that Atlas will shrug. Yeah, those gods again, they keep bringing them up. Atlas will shrug, like the rich people keep threatening, like, oh, yeah, will Ayn Rand turn around and walk away, and then you'll all just fall apart without us. Well, I say instead of eat the rich, ignore the rich. They thrive on the attention that they're getting. They like to have an audience.
Yeah, but let's not leave them there. Let's not leave them there.
Us through that fourth wall. I say ignore the rich. Do not pick up one magazine with an article about rich people in it. Just ignore them, and the power will be gone. That's the best counter curse that I can come up with. We need to make T-shirts. Ignore the rich.
From my own views, probably we need to do a bit more than just ignore them. If we ignore them and they've still got their wealth and their power, that's not so good. But Tyson, just one thing. You mentioned that terrible story about your own people being persuaded somehow to organize singing and song lines in squares. And how did that happen?
Well, that hasn't reached my mob yet.
Oh, I see.
But the further south I travel, the more I see it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's also a very important aspect of that you really talked about, the hunter-gatherer ideas, that you know, people need an egalitarian. You never have all the power and all the authority kind of fused into one figure. There needs to be egalitarianism, which can be shifting through time, who is kind of taking sort of charge. And so ideas like demand share, if somebody's got a lot more than other people ask, and that's whatever that resource is needs to be given, and it keeps circulating and it keeps changing who's got the resource. So ignore the rich. I'm not sure that fits with very ancient human nature, that human nature is about maintaining this basic harmony of egalitarianism. What do you think?
Yeah, I just think most of the things you do are kind of as counter curses. They seldom make much sense. There isn't a kind of logic to them.
Okay.
There's always a weird turnaround, and you think, oh, that's going the wrong way, and then suddenly it goes right. Yeah, I don't know.
But one of them's got to make some sense, otherwise we're all really fucked. I mean, really, yeah. I mean,
I think, like I said, theatre in the round is a good way to bust up that fourth wall and make some infinite regenerative walls.
Yeah,
not even walls. Yeah,
no walls.
It's strange because it kind of, well, there's that counterintuitive thing of, with a theatre in the round, you've made an enclosure that somehow undoes the magic of enclosures. So yeah, like I said, it's counterintuitive. It's seldom, it's not a universe of linear cause and effects. It's not a computer program that runs on if then.
Yeah, sure.
Just a question on anthropology. Did you come across the anthropologist called David McKnight, who did a lot of work on the Rick Munken, and I think it's up in your part of the world? There was
yeah, a little bit. I've actually been more interested in, I mean, I've read a bit from the males, but I was more interested in what the females were finding, particularly linguists. You know, I had a really strong relationship with Barbara Sayers.
Oh yeah.
And she had some really interesting things, particularly about how the Wick language deals with binarisms in these. So she was looking at negated antonyms as a way that you know, yeah, it's a hard thing to explain, but just once again with that same gesture, it's just that.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I'm embedded in my family, and I'm not really too keen on looking at my own world through an anthropological lens, because I just feel like it would kind of ruin it for me. You know?
No, but the rest
Well,
and
it's very valuable
I really
for-
tried to keep any like grammar sort of translation pedagogies that have infected my being over the decades. I've tried to keep that out of my thoughts about my own language as much as possible, but I can't help but notice interesting things about pronouns, etc. sometimes. But that knocks me out of myself when I do that. That separates me. As soon as I start to categorize language or anything like that, it knocks me out of it. And I've lost quite a bit of language over the last 3 years. Like I wake up in the morning and I feel 3 or 4 words have left me in the night, and I think, oh no, I can't remember the word for knee. Yeah. Can I even have a knee? The word for it.
Thank you very much, Tyson. I don't know if there is other questions from our audience. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask. In the meantime, while we're waiting for other questions, I would like to ask more a practical question, because a lot of people are here engaged in the built environment and design. So I would like to ask, how can a designer bring the 4 laws into her or his work? About to speak about like respect, connect, reflect, and direct. This like maybe elaborate something what designers could do now in this time that we are in, relating to climate and society and connecting with each other. So and the land.
Well, I guess that depends on how constrained you are by the people who are paying you, so that you can access shelter and food and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know, we have a lot of lovely ideas. I think most people naturally want to start at the other end of, you know, respect, and then, you know, and that's a thing of spirit really, and then connect, where you build those relationships, and and then reflect. So doing the thinking part, you know, the knowledge part, and then direct, start building, start designing. You know, I think most people would like to do it like that and naturally tend towards doing that. But we're all constrained by an economic system that demands we charge in and start building immediately, start designing immediately, and go backwards through that process. It is an entropic process when it goes backwards, you know, direct, and then stuff it up, and then reflect and examine all your metrics to see where you went wrong, and then go and meet people, connect, and then finally learn that respect at the end as you're walking away or driving away or flying away and your buildings are falling down. Yeah, I think that's pretty much how, I don't know. I don't judge people for doing that, because I don't think that's in anybody's spirit to operate that way. But, you know, we all have KPIs we got to hit. We're all being flogged by the same whip. And, you know, our punishment for not doing things that way is that we lose our shelter and our food. So, you know, it's like, do it any way you have to do it to survive, bros. Hopefully we'll get through this. Yeah. You know, it's almost not even worth putting those ideas out there, because who can actually do it? Who would have the freedom, you know, to be able to do that? Everybody has a master. And
well,
you know.
but Tyson, maybe the master is falling. I mean, maybe at this very moment as we speak, it's not just that strange character in the United States that maybe, you know, is beginning to bite the dust. But I mean, maybe something very, very big is happening to the entire planet, and I think it's worth keeping a little bit of hope that masters can be overthrown right across the planet. And I can't quite believe that you wouldn't have that same idea back of your mind somewhere, even if only as a bit of a joke and a kind of curse.
Well, I feel like that's an emergence that is happening. You know, this system of land and sea that we live on, this and rock and air and everything else, this dynamic system is self-organizing, and it's dealing with a pathogen right now.
Yeah.
And it's throwing up. There are a lot of amazing emergences happening, and it's happening in our spirit. And so you see a lot of little zeitgeists popping up all over the place.
Yeah.
And the problem is that when they rise, and people come together around that common desire and that common frustration signal, they tend to then try and organize into the same pattern that produced this entropy in the first place. You start off with this group, and I've been involved in about half a dozen this year, and they start so wonderfully and creatively and all acting, in this amazing diversity, and this sort of self-organizing entity emerges. And then someone comes out and says, "Oh, I'm the president, and this is the secretary, and this is the treasurer, and we have to have a mission statement. These are our objectives, and we're going to start delegating tasks to people." And I say, it's finished now, because the Anglosphere is a self-organizing system as well, and it has a very good immune system, and it deals with pathogens like green movements, like that. I tell you what, it deals with it faster than Donald Trump dealt with COVID when he got it. It's a bloated, unhealthy looking thing, but I tell you, it's got a robust immune system.
We've
need all the fast food at once. It's probably never going to die somehow.
We've always said that any kind of uprising should never last more than 2 weeks. And then let it all go, surrender everything, but make sure next new moon you're back in action again. Don't outstay the welcome. Don't hold power of any kind, even bottom-up power, for too long, because otherwise you will have a fucking treasurer and an administrator and a president and a mission statement and all those bloody things. And I'm very
and that's where revolutions always fail.
Well, they do. But
every revolution fails because they replicate the patterns of the masters.
There's one revolution like that. But the one that led to your continent and the songlines did not fail, and that was a revolution. It was a revolution which you kept renewing and surrendering and renewing and surrendering cyclically. And that's what we need to get moving. A revolution which knows how to lose power as well as gain it, and do it with the moon and the sun and the seasons. Somehow we've got to get back to that.
Term for that I've heard in English is anarcho-syndicalism.
We call it lunarchy.
Political model. But look, I was speaking of revolution. Here's where things are terrifying. I was talking to David Suzuki the other day, like just a couple of days ago, and I was shocked. He's in a dark place. This is like, David Suzuki, that optimist with the, telling us all about the wonders of biology and the world and delivering all this hope for decades. And he was just sitting there, and he was depressed at the start, and then halfway through he got angry. Like I poked him a bit and he got angry, and he's filled with this rage. And he basically, he thinks we're past a tipping point and we're all stuffed. But he's just saying the only possible option is a massive revolution. So when you've got David Suzuki like calling for massive global violence,
but revolution doesn't need to be violent.
The man is
at a weird place in the culture, eh?
He needs to get some anger management training and therapy.
A revolution implies a turning of things upside down, but it doesn't necessarily imply violence, most especially if it's done from a point of view, as Chris said, something like lunarchy, which is trying to, as you call it, counter-curse time in some way and restore some kind of oscillation or periodicity to time. And we can start at a very fundamental level, which is what you're talking about with the women and the contextual connections, and that fundamental level is kind of going to cut away. It's going to countercurse the binarism and the linear time. I don't think we should just think of revolution in terms of violence.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, they're all different kinds of violence. It was just it was shocking though. He was quite explicitly talking about physical conflict violence, and that really shocked me.
That's true.
But there are all kinds of violence. That there are the warfare that's being carried out against Iraq right now. It's not with missiles. You can kill millions just with sanctions.
Of course.
There's a lot of economic warfare going on. There's all kinds of warfare, and there's some ritual magic warfare. I mean, I reckon when I looked at that Stonehenge, that sort of the patterning that I saw in there was that some bastard tried to bend to the moon cycle in line with the sun cycle.
Yes.
Yep.
That was what I saw when I looked at Stonehenge.
You've got it. I mean, there's a whole
lot of really fast on
the highway because I was going to the pub.
Yeah. just on circles. Did you know when I gave a talk here on Ecodemia about did matriarchy ever exist? I showed a picture. I think I showed a picture of it's in the highlands of eastern Brazil. It's the people called the Canela, and they build their kind of village in a huge circle, a massive bicycle wheel, and all the men on the east are sort of married to the women on the west, but they go to and fro between their wives and their sisters, and that's all connected up in this circle. And I've recently discovered that the very earliest known Neolithic kind of city in Europe, in southern Russia and Ukraine, was a massive, massive circle, like a bicycle wheel, with long houses all around it, and paths connecting up the two sides. So there seems to be an interesting thing where, when you said everything started to go wrong about 10,000 years ago, and it certainly did, that was the sort of start. That was the end of the Ice Age, and the huge mammoths and massive, diprotodons in Australia and these very large game animals. Things did start to go wrong then. But it's interesting to see that when cities first emerged, they weren't hierarchies. It seems as if a lot of the egalitarianism of a matrilocal, matrilineal, largely woman-friendly hunter-gatherer system were initially preserved. And only later did you get these cities turning into despotisms and all the stuff which you talked about, with gender turned into a caste system. Your formulation there is so, it's so helpful to us all, I think, to how gender became caste. Exactly right. But it seems to have been quite a time before that was properly cemented by these princes and kings in the past. And you did have a very cyclical logic, even when you had the earliest cities. It was still preserved to an extent. I think you're right about Stonehenge, though. I think Stonehenge was definitely some patriarch trying to claim that the sun was really the moon and fit all the cycles together and all that crap. Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I mean, you. I think from whatever, and that was the moment, but from whatever moment it was, and it was probably when they started smelting different metals together, I don't know, but whatever the moment was where people had that idea that they could try and control these wild women, that was probably where it all come undone.
Oh, exactly. That's so beautifully put. So beautifully put. Yeah, exactly. Control the wild women. Yeah.
Thank you, Tyson. I have there is one question in the chat. It's about settlement and selection of land. Is that permanent or temporal? And how is it built and flourished? And when it's left is left? Yeah, that's a question.
When it is left. Well, I mean, these things just with that snake eating its tail and the infinite growth model, it's all about scale. Everything has to be about scale, So a settlement it's a wrong word, because nobody's settling. People are frantically building and growing and sort of pathologizing the landscape in that way. Yeah, settlement is kind of the wrong word. And you'll see that villages have been very different. I mean, I guess, you know, Camilla will know, you know, about the setup of African villages and a lot of the really interesting fractal patterns those are built on, you know, like this African geometry is very, very different. And, you know, because in this way, the growth of your, you know, village can scale infinitely, but into the micro rather than into the macro, if that makes any sense. So you'll see that fractal pattern repeated right throughout the village and right down until it goes to that central hut. And then inside that hut, you'll find a miniature village there with the same one going down. And inside that little model, you'll find in that same hut there's another one, and it goes in, it scales infinitely into the micro rather than the macro. And that is the counter curse of increase. So humans forever have increase ceremonies. And that increase is never about increasing the size of the system. Increase ceremony is about only increasing the relations and connections between the nodes in the system. About, you know, increasing the combinatorials that can happen infinitely in there. You know, so if you've got 1,000 nodes, there are 1 billion combinatorials of 3 that can happen.
And these are the sunlights.
It's how everything works. It's how everything's always worked. And that's I guess that's the counter curse, is this idea of reintroducing the idea of increase, you know, against that idea of growth. And you can't name it. You're cursing your action if you name it using the word of the thing that you're against. So you can't call it degrowth. If you make a degrowth economy, economic model, that will fall apart as well, because it comes under the same curse. You got to change it, flip around the other way, look for increase models.
I think there is a momentary case for using a word like decolonize or degrowth, but I agree with you, don't stick with it. Just make it a transitional term, just so that people can keep track of what's going on. I don't think you can
I like Tyson's advice there very much, actually. My instinct, and that's why we've always preferred things like lunarchy, because that's like playing with lunacy, playing with the tricks that have been played on us, but restoring, you know, what we need to pay attention to.
Well, it's either that or kill the prince and drag him around the city a few times.
But make sure it's counterclockwise when you do that.
It is. I think maybe a regenerative. It could be a word like a regenerative economy, or that.
Yeah, I'm seeing that word coming up to replace that that stupid word sustainability. Lately, nobody seems to really understand. But yeah, regenerative really says what it means, and I like it. Some people don't, but I like the way the language changes, you know, with spirit when that system, you know, has that emergences happen, that language just emerges for that. I like that regenerative.
Yeah, someone in the comment section is saying, I believe the original French term for degrowth did have that flavor to it, but it got somewhat lost in translation.
Right.
So, yeah, but
your always get lost in translation. English had to borrow half its words from French because it didn't have enough words for things. But then English is a trade creole, so it doesn't really have a place. It's just a patchwork.
By the way,
stolen bits from different languages from around the world. The same in English, and that Anglosphere becomes the repository for all knowledge, which is then removed from its context and rebranded, sanitized, and has the spirit stripped out of it, and you know, becomes scalable, saleable, priceable, you know, in these little units for us. Like that mindfulness, goddamn training we're all supposed to.
Oh, for God's sake. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Out of here.
Rip something out of a place. We're just going to rip this tradition out of India and, like, you know, knock the dirt off it. Knock all that dirty spirit off it, and we're just going to make this bloody corporate, crappy little practice that you can follow through a series of bullet points on a PDF that gets emailed to you.
Yeah. Mindfulness was designed for U.S. soldiers to be mindful while they were killing the people of Vietnam during the Vietnam War. It's like, make sure you're relaxed and calm while you're doing all this massacring. But I've just got one little question, Tyson. That Frenchman that you mentioned, and you weren't sure we could catch his name, was it Descartes? Was he the one that you...
I'm not sure. I'm not even sure that that's a true story. But
I think it was Nostradamus.
Nostradamus.
I see. Nostradamus. All right, actually,
Different type of Frenchman.
I see. Okay.
The alchemy.
Yeah, I think the mathematician who he did a TED talk about it. If you look up African fractals in TED Talks, you'll find that fellow. He talks about that story. But I've heard conflicting stories about that. But I don't care. It sounds like good story to me, and I'm keeping it. I don't care if it's as countercultures go. That's good story.
Yeah, there is such a thing as science, and it is quite important sometimes to distinguish between fact and fiction.
Well, it is. But for example, how did science come up with the idea that before agriculture, 30% of human beings died in homicides?
Yeah, well, that's all stupid.
Tell me that data set.
That's not science.
That's ideology. That's the warfare model. That's just
it's not science.
Version of
You gotta
science.
look out for that, because Hobbes will sneak in and pretend to be a scientist from time to time.
Yeah, I know.
Hmm.
They're
But
tricks.
that's Anglosphere ideology, as you say.
Yeah. No, I got a lot of respect for the scientific method. I do it all the time.
I can hear it all the time. I can hear it in your voice, the respect with the laws of thermodynamics. Bloody brilliant. Yeah.
I'm really keen that you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. When you tip out that dirty bathwater, don't lose the baby. And when I look in that bathtub after the water's out, I see science is still there. But a lot of the wrong stories at the foundation of some theories, those wrong stories are gone. And the myth of primitivism is one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're absolutely sure.
Yeah, the scientific method is, at least as I understand, it's a tool. It's not something to have to use as a worldview or a value. It's a tool to understand some specific thing, but something that you can use for. There are so many other ways of understanding being in space, being in time, being in the world. So.
Well, the best thing about science is that it knows that every model is wrong.
That's
every theory is wrong, but it's useful in certain contexts for prediction.
Exactly.
That's it. That's all the people standing.
Also, a means of trying to collectivize. It's one of the major means that the West has of trying to collectivize knowledge or ideas.
And it should prevent gurus. It should prevent people from making stuff up, because, as you said,
so you can give us that Nobel Prize for a start.
Yes, I know, but on the other hand,
that's a bastard that's holding up that's holding up physics really badly.
Yeah.
So, it's holding up a lot of disciplines.
I know.
People who have prizes and tenures and stuff like that, and
rubbish. It's all rubbish. But as you said, it's
a hadron collider that does nothing. And so we've got to sit on string theory for bloody a few decades until a few old bastards die before we can try in another direction.
But it's the only world religion which knows that it's wrong, and it's always wrong. All of its models are always wrong.
That's where it's good. Yeah.
I know. Nice.
Okay, Mariam, you want to say something?
Tyson, I was wondering if you can show us. Did you show us all the artifacts that you had, because it was beautiful and your stories with it was fascinating?
Yeah, certainly not all of them. I think 3 is enough. Like, I've got some of the other ones at the other end of the house, but a lot of them, like, we don't sort of make these things to sort of keep them in a pile. They should have actually been distributed out, but COVID, lockdown, all that sort of thing. But half of them are out with other people. now doing their work, you know. Yeah.
Brilliant.
We've only got a few left, really, and those ones will be gone soon, because they've got to, you know, you can't hold things and accumulate them. You've got to, you do that, you get sick.
Send them around.
That's how any node in a complex adaptive system needs to be behaving. It's interacting, exchanging continuously. You pass things on, other things come in. You try and hold it, you kill it. It's finished, and you end up with nothing.
Yeah. William Blake said that about the bird, the flying bird. You must never hold on to it. You kill the song.
And he who bends to himself a joy doth the winged life destroy. That wasn't, hang on, no, that wasn't Blake. That was one of the other syphilitic from that time. Can't remember which one.
Was.
Yeah, they all had the same idea.
Anyway, you've remembered it much better than I did.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tyson. Maybe before we go, we close it off for today. Maybe can you talk briefly about, you said in our culture there is no division between land and time, or space and time. Maybe you can say shortly about something.
Just really briefly.
Yeah.
Very good question.
Look, I guess, you know, that there is a protocol in Indigenous knowledge that you defer to the person who has the better knowledge of those things. So I'll just refer you to Einstein on that one if you like, and you can. You can see what that curvature looks like. But I will tell you that curvature is like the rainbow. It's only the edge of something much bigger, that is much vaster. You know, that rainbow that you're seeing, it's not there. Well, it is there, but it's everywhere else as well at once. It's just what it looks like from where you're standing. And so in that same way, with that bend of things, you know, that are two things but one thing, you know, that, you know, time is space, space is time, and you're kind of moving through it. And whatever pattern of logic you're employing sort of offers you that. But I tell you, if you're experiencing your time in a different way, a non-linear way, then you're going to see that rainbow very differently. But, you know, we're all making models to, you know, figure out how to navigate this quantum sort of reality that we're all in with very limited faculties to perceive it. I think that's all I'll say about that. It's back there if you look through all that story I said in the first and second laws of thermodynamics. If you try and imagine time through the first law of thermodynamics instead, then you'll get a picture of that. You do your own thought experiment. I wasn't the first one to come up with that idea, by the way. Charles Darwin did it before me. He proposed a different model of time based on the first law. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
We've always had our best thinkers, and always the best science has been done before there were universities. Like, the best thinkers have never been researchers. They've never had a doctorate. They've just been people with enough resources and backing to go out into the world and take a look at things. You know, I think they're calling that alt-ac now, that alternative academy. It's almost like the alt-right, but for eggheads.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.